Welcome to the Song of Solomon's, or Solomon, Songs of Solomon, or Song of Songs, or Canticle of Canticles. It's been goes by lots of different names. The Song of Solomon is, or Song of Songs is in. And remember at the beginning we talked about the Tanakh. There was the Torah, the Ketuvim, and this is part of the Torah is the law, and then there's the prophets, and this is part of the writings. And this is part of wisdom literature, by some considered part of wisdom literature, but it also is more poetic. And as we talk about a little bit about its interpretation history over the years, just broadly, we'll see how the poetic side of it and the allegorical side of it actually play a significant role in really how we understand who God is in relationship to us. And the funny thing, and I'm just going to, I'll just say this now. You can't talk about the Song of Songs without talking about sex or sexuality or attraction or intimacy or union or these things that often in the church we're like, oh, I can't talk about that. It's taboo. And again, I've said this before, there are three things in our culture that we have made taboo: birth, sex, and death. And so this is this book in the Bible that really has had some controversy over why it was included. And when you understand why it was included in the original canon, you might say, well, should it really have been? But interestingly enough, when you look at the history of how it's been understood and developed, it really, the sort of punchline first, it really connects the idea of who God is to Israel from a Jewish perspective, or who we, the church, are to Christ. And so, so those are the sort of two main allegorical ways. The other way is that it really represents sort of a portrait of I want to say it's the best portrait of biblical spirituality that is some way meant to represent what it was in the garden, or an image of what sexuality or connection was in the garden. And it really is less about the physicality, the literal nature of sexual relationships. And I remember as a teen, turning the pages and you read, all these little things that sound like innuendos, and you're trying to read it into everything and see what parts you can make sound sexual. But the reality is, the sexuality in Song of Songs is not really about sexuality or physicality. It is about intimacy, and connection and union, that and really in almost a spiritual realm, but manifested in some sort of physical description. It's not meant to be literal. You good, Carla? If you need, don't go anywhere. You stick with us. This you have to be uncomfortable with the rest of us as we talk about the Song of Songs. But so, and we'll look at that as we break it down and we look at it. And so just think of it. It is, but here's the thing: is the name itself is meant to sort of put it up on the, when I was talking about the mystical side about this union. And actually, one of the books that I would, and you're welcome to borrow it. I read it many, many years ago in a class about mystics, but it's Janaea Goyon's book of A Song of Songs. And actually, it was written, I think, in the 16th or 17th century. I don't actually remember, but it was written, I know, after the Reformation. But it was eventually, she wrote. She was a young woman who wrote this sort of expression of Song of Songs, and it wasn't like a great interpretation from a scholastic level, but it tapped in. And she came from a really abused situation, and she's writing about this mystical union and understanding it between God and the church, or Christ and the church. And really she doesn't even deal with some of the more physically descriptive passages that seem sexual in nature, but just the way she describes the union between God and humanity, or divine and human, ultimately got it banned. And she actually kind of comes out of a really abusive sort of situation where she, when I think it was maybe 12, when she was young, she was married off to someone who was older and was abused by him and his mother-in-law. And it was just, and it's a really sad story. But out of this comes really a devotional book or a mystical book that captures an expression of mystical union with God that is really more akin to the medieval period, kind of the 13th through the maybe 14th century, where you get a really mystical side of the church. It sort of recovers that tradition. So, but it has lots of themes of overcoming abuse, and the irony of that is she describes this ideal of this loving relationship not only between a man and a woman, but between a God and divine and human. But the argument, the tragedy of her tale is that she was sold off into marriage, or her dad basically gave her to a stranger for marriage, and she was never able to experience the type of love she describes, both either theoretically on an earthly level, or reality on an earthly level, but theoretically she could have experienced still in some sort of mystical level. So a classic in Christian spirituality through the ages. So recommended. If you don't want to buy it, you can borrow it or from my library. What I was going to say was that the reason this mystical union is so important is because it kind of transcends our bodies. And you look through this whole theme of the Old and New Testament, there's always a sense of we're fallen and this is our lives lead to death. But there's this spiritual union that is connecting our spirit to God's spirit. And it's meant, and so when it says Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, it really is saying it's best of the best, or this is the greatest. And so it's kind of like, of all of Solomon's writings, this is the best one. Of all of the songs that are out there, this is the superlative of them. And so we have this sense that it has or Jews would have at the time had the sense that it was important. And the interesting thing about that is that it's not dated, but we know that it comes after, obviously, Solomon, and because it references him. It's thought to actually, and there are some that would argue for that, because it kind of, in the beginning, in the first chapter, you have this dialogue between this woman and this supposed king who could have been King Solomon. But more likely, they think that it was actually probably written after the exile, so sort of late 6th century. And the reason is there are Aramaic references that come out, and idioms that come from the culture of that sort of century, in the syntax and vocabulary that they find in both, where was it? I wrote it down. Mesopotamian literature, where the dialogue was very similar between a god and gods and goddesses, and also in ancient Egyptian literature and love poetry, that they found books that sort of echo that sort of these same sentiments. So again, they kind of date it by looking at some of the way things are written, comparatively, how they might have been written previous, and who knows? I mean, maybe it was bits and pieces and fragments that were compiled. The Egyptian love poem collection is considered a collection of small little poems, kind of like Proverbs. But actually, the Song of Songs is considered one whole piece. And it's not often understood that way or read that way, because you can kind of piece through, and there's kind of chunks at different points, and it kind of switches up, first person, second person, like kind of goes back and forth, and it's hard to track. In a few minutes, we're going to actually go through it, and I'll sort of point where there are some cues that tell you basically what happens is this is a dialogue. It's a dialogue, presumably, that is written from the female perspective, in a description of the man, and then there's the man voice that comes in, and it's sort of narrating the man's voice. And so it becomes this dialectical sort of back and forth between the man and the woman, with a few insertions here, all the while also being sort of this teaching book to this sort of mysterious group called the Daughters of Zion, or Lebanon, or Daughters of where was it? Daughters of, I forget what they're called. Daughters of Zion. Um, and sometimes I think they were also called daughters of women, daughters of Jerusalem, daughters of Zion. So they're speaking almost to, it's a woman's almost speaking to other women about this idea of union and connection, and desire and all these things that are a part of our humanity. And I'll say, just as an aside, because this book does have references that go back to the Garden of Eden, I do think that our understanding of sexual desire was different. Whatever that desire was something different prior to the fall than it was after. We fell in our composition, and our image of God became depraved, and whatever form of sexuality or understanding of sexual relation in the purpose and intent of that somehow changed or shifted in the makeup of everything we changed. And again, going back to that where it says that God says to Eve, your desire will be for the man, and he will rule over you. And so there is that sense of what was that desire, and I think that this captures it. And I don't want to over sexualize the text, because I don't think that that's what it's trying to do in the sense of the way we perceive that from a 21st century lens. One, it was way more natural back then. Those things were way more open. You had many kids in the same room. I remember someone saying a farmhouse in the 19th century, everyone's in the same room. Kids know about sex because they go in the barn and they see it out there, and it's in the house. You lived in a 16 by 16 foot log house with light dividers. And so there's just a different take on what these things mean, and we often interpret them and make them a little bit more taboo than what they ought. And then the challenge of that, and the reason is that the minute you take our taboos around sexuality and you want to put them in the realm of spirituality, if you just interpret this in terms of this is a male-female relationship in terms of intimacy, but then somehow in the midst of this we're expected to make the leap that it's this intimacy between Christ and the church, or between God and Israel. And so people tend to avoid the book, but it contains some profound thoughts around desire, around affection, around care, around an idealization of what it means to belong and be in union with someone. Okay. Interestingly enough, it's called Song of Solomon, but his name only comes up 6 times throughout the whole book. And in fact, those 6 times were part of the reason that it was included in the canon. Because they couldn't, and you would say, well, what about there are other things that kind of hint towards Solomon. This one was just one of those that there, because it was the way it was understood or described, when the process time came to figure out, was this something they were going to include in the canon, it was included. And then the other main reason, and actually you should know, in Jewish the canon, it wasn't included really until sometime between the 2nd and 1st century before Christ. So it was probably one of the latest books, which is why you find it at the end of those Ketuvim writings. Christians have maintained it because it presents a strong allegorical relationship that connects to a lot of Pauline writings, so Paul's letters, about the relationship between Christ and the church, his bride. And you again have 2 speakers. It's not considered Solomon. And there's actually a whole body of literature that tries to refute it, because they say that the intimacy that's described here wouldn't be from Solomon. Solomon had over 700 wives, many from other tribes and nations, and that intimacy that is described in this is just sort of thought that would not have been something that he would have participated in. And because it comes after and dates much later, or they think it dates much later, there is this sense that it again is not actually about him, but it's about this female personification, and whether it was actually written by a female or just personified as a female, there's been some debate about that as well. Jews read it on the first Sabbath of the Passover, interestingly enough, again, it's a love tale between Israel and, from the Jewish perspective, in the allegorical sense, is a love tale between Israel and God. I think that's it. Oh, I know what it was going to say else. In the Christian interpretation, it was probably, I think it was the first, or it was the 2nd century, with a guy named Origen who came into the scene and interpreted it sort of in relationship to God and or Jesus and the church. And then it really got originally interpreted through just being God and all of covenant people. And then it wasn't until the 11th century, so almost 1,000 years into the church, that they actually, you see a decisive switch in literature that shifts it from God and just general covenant children of God to Christ and the church. And then in the 12th century, that actually led to describing, and this is the development of the Roman Catholic Church at the time, although it was just the Roman Church then, but Mary as that bride. And so and really, but the funny thing about it is, if you look during that 12th, 3rd century, that's kind of where that mystical stuff come. That's where the whole notion of the stigmata, and self-flagellation and self-discipline, and there was a lot of misappropriated mystical understanding of and I mean, and I say that lightly because of the fact that I don't think any of us have the corner on the market, but in some sense, the stuff that went on during that mystical, like extreme fasting to be like Christ, and self-harm, and a lot of abusive stuff. But again, no one was reading anything back then. It was all mediated through the church and through pictures and through stained glass windows and through oral tradition. And so much of what we understand now, we can look back and we say, well, they didn't have any clue because they were being led by a larger system. So, okay. Any questions thus far? Thoughts? Was it okay? You guys, everyone doing all right?
What did you mean by the Mary inference? I didn't catch that.
So the 12th century, basically they took it from being that it was Christ and the bride, sort of, to it was the bride was sort of transitioned to a little bit in the veneration of Mary, as being this virgin, and sort of the desire that Mary had for the union. There's a mystical union that happened in Mary's womb that we just can't put into words or understand. And that sense of that union, in that sense of intimacy and connection, is something that is thought, or that during the 12th, 13th century was thought to be characterized in this book.
Okay. Thank you.
But it's in keeping with a whole bunch of other stuff from that period as well. So it's not like it stands as an anomaly to interpretation. That's what I'm saying, is there's a lot of stuff that was extreme there. And again, we don't know, why it was written. Maybe it's not supposed to be in the Bible. I don't know. Maybe we should chop out Ecclesiastes.
Jim didn't like Kings either. Was it Kings you didn't like, Jim?
Jim's just slashing left and right. Reckless abandon. What's that, Jim?
I do a lot of chopping.
A lot of chopping.
I think it only have the title of James.
I think it would be like, that's just the whole Bible. That's all you need. I actually thought it would be good to have each Bible sometimes as its own book, like you pulled a little, but they're probably not. And that way you're just feel like you're reading the sense of what it was. Okay, let's talk about some issues with the book in general, or just some characteristics of it. They're not necessarily always issues. There has been a lot of debate whether this was a collection or whether it's one unified piece of literature, and most scholarships say that it's actually it's unified literature. Because of the dialogue that goes back and forth between the man and the woman, and because it's continual throughout, and because there's connections in several themes that are found earlier and also later. For example, the themes of embrace are found in chapter 2 and 8. The themes of mutual possession or connection in that sort of possessive way are found in 2 and 6. There are 2 significant dream sequences that I'll highlight in a few minutes in 3 and 5. And all of these these little literary features that connect different parts of, when you have connection here, you have connection over here, you have connection over here. Well, when you start to see the whole picture, and there's a uniformity. That doesn't mean that they didn't take manuscripts of this thing being copied and that things hadn't changed and there were editorial decisions made. But again, we trust that was led by the Holy Spirit. But there is a sense of unity. So the argument that this is like the Egyptian love poetry book that is definitively a collection of poems, this is thought to be one sort of continuous dialogue, but obviously reflects some editorial choices that have probably happened over the years. The dialogue between, it's presumed that it's between a man and a woman, and it's presumed that it's written more from the female perspective. And there is much debate over whether the author or the compiler of this was a woman or just representation. There is a third group of characters, and those are the daughters of Jerusalem or the daughters of Zion, and they're sort of this extra piece that feels almost like there's someone being taught by this. Like this is caution to understand how to approach a love or intimacy. And original thought that it was actually more of a direct application. There is this sort of advisement that love is powerful, love is strong as death, and you'll see these sort of admonitions that go throughout. And then it says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, do not stir up or awaken love until it is ready. And you see that refrain various points throughout the book. And they're saying that love is such a powerful thing until you come to an age of maturity. Don't stir it up because it is such a consuming passion. And in the last chapter of the book, as we'll look at in a minute, there's this whole narrative that actually talk about this young woman and her developmental cycle and whether or not she has breasts. And the idea is not really about her physicality, recognizing that everyone comes in different shapes and sizes, but really it was more so about her maturity level, and that she was not at a place where she ought to be embracing this sense of mature love or the full embrace of love, which is again what makes this book so ironic, because she was given to someone at a very young age, probably before she was mature enough to actually comprehend all of it. But again, that was how they did it for many years.
Well, I was going to say, Jason, you're talking about maturity levels of the ladies, and yet in those days, wasn't it quite common for them to be considered wives at 14 years old? So what were they talking about?
No, it was, but the interesting thing about it is that section at the end, written both from a male and a female perspective, there's dialogue there, because once he's saying sister, like there is a sense of protecting a young woman before she is ready to actually be in a place of what they would have considered a mature woman. So in other words, it functions as a way of saying, before you step into this adult world of love and connection. But again, that's on that very literal application sort of level. When you take, and that's the challenge of it, is that because this is interpreted both from Jewish and Christian traditions as being allegorical, you have to sort of take a 30,000 foot perspective and look for the themes of it, and not get bogged down into the phrases in it and try to interpret, because the reality, there's one dialogue, or there's one sort of someone that the male voice is praising the female voice, but they're talking about her hair being like horses of Lebanon and smelling like it's just, there's nothing that the description of you would get slapped in the face if you said if you try to pick up a woman with these sort of lines in a bar. Your hair is like the horses of Lebanon, and you smash. But because it's not really meant to be about the exact thing on this earth, it's meant to be, you got to hover a little above the exact description and say, what is actually happening here? What is the larger picture that is being presented through this dialogue? And again, you're going to see those are themes of desire and attraction and longing in a very meaningful and powerful way. And as this is interpreted through Christian history, it becomes the church's longing for Christ and the intimacy that we experience spiritually beyond the boundaries of our human, constructs, and that we find some connection with our with between this divine human relationship. So we can look at it both ways, and we are kind of looking at it and straddling both ways, because it's worth making sure we see it from both perspectives. But keep in mind that from most Jewish and Christian traditions, this is an allegory, not really meant to describe something literal.
Well, you were mentioning the fact that it had some of the writings had a female tendency. Did they really have any female writer, or especially religious writers in those days, though?
Well, that's why the speculation is there, because like wisdom was personified as a woman, but in the New Testament, the church is personified as Christ's bride.
Yeah.
So there's still, there's distinct female imagery, and
Right.
Okay. Anything else on that? I feel like you're not saying something, Denny.
No, you got to be careful what you say, Jason. There's a bunch of
Yeah, I know. Trust me. But I can say things that are from scholars beyond that. I'm just the messenger. And in that light, I would say that also in postmodern interpretation, there is questions around the dialogue between, if it's actually still between a man and a woman in chapter 8, or whether it's between two women. And I think it vacillates a little bit. And again, that deals with the whole notion of the young girl or the young woman who is not ready for the next stage. What else? The genre, it's considered really to be about poems of yearning and longing. And interestingly enough, and I think it's interesting when you think about it in terms of the divine human relationship, there's this theme almost of teasing, of flirting that runs through it. There's a part, I don't remember what chapter, but where he's saying, "Let me in," and it's like in the middle of the night. He's saying, "Let me in." My head is wet with dew, and my locks are, and I want to come. And then she's like, "No, I'm not gonna. I'm already tucked in for the night." You got to have this sort of medieval picture of Rapunzel out talking out her tower window, and so him trying to use some lame excuse of getting up. He wants to come in. Oh, my hair's wet. I'm getting wet out here. Let me in. And then she comes to the door, and he's gone. And so it's again that interplay of desire and longing and sustained passion that both feed into the sexual nature of it, but also into the allegorical relationship between divine and human. Again, it resembles a lot of literature from Egyptian and Mesopotamian literature. And again, we've saw that in the other wisdom books, so it's not surprising as these things were compiled that there would be cultural overlap and maybe wisdom overlap. And just because Solomon's wisdom was given, God gave Solomon wisdom, doesn't mean that wisdom didn't spread beyond the boundaries of Israel, and over time infiltrated other cultures. So there could be sort of that relationship where it's reciprocal. Some things get passed on, and again, we trust that was led and guided by God's hand. The thing that's important about what's that?
I was going to say, and what you just said, in that respect, most people in those days weren't literate. And so they had people that were literate that went around, storytellers that went around telling the others, they'd go from town to town being storytellers. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So you can imagine this being read to people, or more likely recited, because there probably would have been some level of memorization for sections of it or portions of it. And of the books of the Bible that talk about love, this is one of the few that dip past that sense of agape love that we talk about. So there are three types of love. I'm sure you learned this in Sunday school or junior high or somewhere. Three types of love represented in Scripture. There's eros, which is sort of attractional, both physical and sort of, in an emotional way, but definitely attractional based, even to the extent in a negative sense, a lustful sort of love or desire to consume. You have the sort of Philadelphia version of love, and that is brotherly love and sort of, or sisterly love, or sibling type love that is meant to sort of express our common love for our neighbor. And then there's this agape love that is sort of defined by God's understanding of who God is in relationship to us, and in that agape love is meant to reflect a self-giving. That there is an emptying of oneself. So Christ came to the earth and emptied himself as if his divinity in love to be a part of our humanity. And this taps into somewhat of that eros love in its imagery, but I think it actually is trying to point more toward the sense of that pure agape love, of that self-giving, of that longing, of the desire. But it blurs the lines a little bit, that sometimes, again, it's challenging. The historical critical tradition, not that you really want to know this, but really views it more as it really in a more of a sexual sense between a man and a woman, or God and humanity. A lot of these imageries they thought were pointing towards the image of what a wedding should be. But in other cultures, some of the same liturgies or language pointed towards liturgical celebrations of other deities, so love for a deity. Although traditionally, again, the Jews interpreted it as God's relationship with Israel, as they ought, as it comes out of their wisdom literature tradition. But we then reinterpreted it again throughout the first millennia of the church in terms of being more about Christ. It does reflect some sentiments of Hebrew prophecy, where they describe God's relationship to Israel as being in more of a husbandry or wifery situation, and that can be found in several of the prophets. It is the interesting thing about it, and I thought this was actually really sort of fascinating. It is different from the rest of the books of the Bible, regardless of whether they're Old or New Testament, because most books of the Bible portray God as being up here and us being down here. You can see my little fingers. This is God up here. And this is us down here, the bottom of the screen. You catch that? You see that? It's like little. But this idea that God's big and we're little and we're insignificant. And you see that in the New Testament as well. God's omnipotent and God's spirit is everywhere and God's moving in the power. And then humans are being these vessels. And there's a definitive inequality in who we are in relationship to God. But in this book, if you take the allegorical perspective on it and say it's about God's relationship with Israel, or the Christ's relationship with the church, his bride, then it feels much more equal. There's a definitive mutuality between the two voices. There's a desire on both sides. There's a sense of connection. There's not a dominance, although there's a few places where it dips into that and could be interpreted that way. But by and large, there is no other book in the Hebrew or Christian canon that presents our relationship to God on such equal terms. Just digest that for a second. Interesting.
Well, in digesting that, I would think back in those days that would seem like it'd be sacrilegious. That church would not like that idea.
Well, I mean, it was written in a time probably that they might have interpreted it more in a literal sense. Like this was more of a guide for what a biblical or a Jewish marriage should look like. Yeah. In other words, those interpretations of God and Israel were not necessarily the initial understanding of the book. Not that those themes that wouldn't have been extrapolated out of it, but that's why those are historical critical perspectives say that it was probably more understood in the time for Jews to deal with sort of a portrait of, and you'll see that again, it talks about, there's a lot of garden imagery, and the idea is that it connects to that creation account, that this is a sort of an exemplification of what a biblical sexual relationship should be between a man and a woman. And then over time, it became understood a little more broadly. All right. Any other questions? And then we're gonna sort of walk through it. You want to walk through it? No? Is this painful? Is this a painful book for you all? You know, I was raised in a medical family. My father was an anesthesiologist, and we talked about all measure of things at the kitchen table. So there are very few topics that make me uncomfortable. So if I'm making you uncomfortable, I apologize. Jim, am I making you uncomfortable, Jim?
Always.
What are you gonna say?
I don't get the takeaway here. I just don't get it. I mean, it just doesn't fit to anything that we've read in the Bible so far. It just.
I agree.
And so what are we all supposed to take out of it? I guess is my question. Maybe you already explained it, but I'm not that good.
No, I don't think I think I've kind of I've said it, but probably not in an explicit way. I think at the end, here's the thing. There's a long history of interpretation around this, and it's either been looked at as being taboo, or it's been looked at from a mystical, spiritual sense, which then also feels taboo because it makes people uncomfortable with some of the language around it. But in the end, those who look at it from a literal perspective could say that that it's meant to describe more of the relationship between a man and a woman. Now, you just take it from that perspective if you want, and some may. If you want to look at it from an allegorical perspective, then you say it's really meant to resemble or define or describe the relationship that we have with Christ, in that sense of longing and desire and seeking out some sense of union. And again, that's we sort of squirm when we talk about like that, because it seems kind of weird. And this is what I said in the medieval period, when all that other stuff was going on, there's all sorts of writings that were written that almost describe a woman's relation, and they're often written by women, a relationship with Christ that is so sexual sounding, you'd be aghast. But it wasn't meant in any sort of, it wasn't really meant in that way. It's almost like this deep, profound, existential, soulful, something deep in us that is beyond the physicality of our humanity. But the only way we can express it is in some sort of broken understanding of how we relate to one another as a man and a woman, if you could. But beyond that, there's this spiritual union that happens, and because it is celebrated and culminated, it's meant to be a portrait almost of the end times, when we are when that final consummation of this redemption project comes into fruition through the final judgment, and when it's all said and done. And so that union we're seeking is not a physical union, it goes much deeper. So it's poetry. I mean, like, honestly, if you give me a book of poetry, I'll be like, I like a lot of things. I like some slam poetry. I like Shel Silverstein. I like poetry that is kind of junior high-ish. I like, but other than that, I'm not a real big poetry person. So, but I think poetry was a way of describing it. And I think that it may not resonate with us in terms of its meaning, but in terms of Israel, it was meant to describe this sort of deep, powerful desire, longing for union with God. And that's something that's meant to be a spirit sort of thing, not really in the realms of the physical. It's just, there's only so many things, we're limited by our words and our common symbols to express our praise and affection for God and for one another. Yes, Nana.
I agree. I have a lot of trouble with this book, but one thing I did get out of it was how much the lover thought about his beloved, how much he valued her, how beautiful he thought she was, and that sort of thing. And if you look at Christ looking at us that way, I think we don't always see ourselves worthy of him or even something that he would desire. And to me, that was a helpful thing out of this book, but
Yeah.
It's a little hard to
Well,
really
it is.
understand why it's in the Bible.
Well, and honestly, if you haven't, I mean, you know, if this shouldn't be the first time you've thought, why is this in the Bible along this journey we've been on? But, you know, there are things that are in books that you're like, why is this included in here? You know, when you start to dig around in scripture, it's not as clean and tidy as we have always sort of been told it is. And that's okay. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing, actually. It's one of those things that it may feel like your leg is being kicked a little bit out from underneath you of your four-legged chair, but you still got three good ones, and that's a Trinitarian reference. Just kidding. Donna or Glenda.
This book kind of grows on you because I like the language. It's so well. I like poetry, and so it's.
By the way, I got to interrupt. Glenda just got her poem put into the Colorado magazine.
Big.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
It took me a second to process that. I didn't know it was coming out of your mouth there.
That's not where I was going. That's what.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, the language is very figurative. There's a lot of imagery, metaphor, simile. My love is like, it's like this, it's like that. And I mean, they're concept there, but it shows, I mean, it's just kind of all the beauty of love. It is idealizing love just as a concept or as a human experience.
Yeah.
And whether you take that on just the human level or on our relationship with God, love is what it's all about. God is love.
Yeah.
So there is a certain way that this, no matter how you interpret this, it does teach you about yourself and about God.
And it says a lot about human love.
Yes.
And, you know, and when you think about the wisdom that is presented in Proverbs and maybe a little bit in Ecclesiastes and Job, that sense of fear of God is the love. The love of wisdom is the fear of God. Well, this is a different type of love. This is a different expression of love, and it's consuming. And I think this sort of warns against some of the power of love, saying again, be careful until you're ready for this. So, real quick, let me see where we have 11 minutes left. I just want to we can just sort of flip through it. I just want to point out a few things. If you have your Bibles with you, you can look at it. I think it opens beautifully. You know, it talks about just this. It immediately jumps into this relationship between these two characters. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. This is in 1:2. 1:1 just sort of says what the Song of Solomon's, which is Solomon's, and again, that's probably the reason it was originally included in the canon, or one of the main reasons. But let him kiss me with the kisses of mouths, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name, and so as there's just you're drawn into this sort of love poetry. I do think it's interesting. And it has been used a lot in our culture these days. In verse 5, I am black and beautiful, daughters of Jerusalem. There's a sense of, but I don't think it's necessarily meaning to referring to, you know, any particular race or region of the world, as much as it is meant to sort of be, you see that in verse 6, I do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has gazed on me. There's a sense of being grounded on the earth and affected by the earth, kind of in an Ecclesiastes sort of way. The sun shines on us all, but you have this sort of a voice of a woman, and then it switches over in verse 8 to a voice of a man. If you do not know, O fairest among women, follow the tracks of the flock to the pastures of your kids beside the shepherd's tent, and then it just goes back. And then you have, I compare you, my love, to the mare of Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are comely with ornaments, your neck a string of jewels. And then it goes on, and it really has this sort of adoration of who the male figure is, but it's not just one-sided, because then later on, as some of you noted, it flips it and it describes the female in an equally sort of majestic way. And there's just this sense. And I think and what you see in that, Glenda, is there's beauty. there's such desire and love and passion for the other that it just flows. And if you don't see the desire when you read it again when you're feeling sappy. And just imagine these characters and this dialogue going back, and there's just a longing to be with one and to consume one, in that sense of the overwhelming power of that love. At the end of 2:7, you see this, and it says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the wild does not stir up or awaken love until it is ready. Do not stir up or awaken love till it is ready. There's just caution. And again, this is one of those things that if the Proverbs were written for a young man, and even in that last chapter in 31 being the mother speaking to the son, this is almost written in some ways to the daughters to describe. And again, from originally written, if it was written more in a direct application way rather than an allegorical way, that meant it was practical advice. Be careful. Love is a powerful thing. Moving on to chapter 3. This is a major passage of yearning. Upon my bed at night, I sought him who my soul loves. I sought him and found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. And it's this longing, and it's this search, and it has this imagery that sort of harkens back to Proverbs of the siren of wisdom on the corner calling the fools to her. And this is the same sense of calling, of seeking, of desire. And again, you see in 3:5, I adjourn you, daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles, do not stir up with love until it is ready. And again, in 11, daughters of Jerusalem, look out. And there's a sense of this caution. 4 moves into the voice of a man. And this is where you see again, this sort of, again, it falls into the metaphor, how beautiful you are, my love, how beautiful your eyes are doves behind your veil. Well, I don't know what that means, but if I said, Shannon, your eyes are like doves, she'd be like, what's wrong with you? So it doesn't make sense to us because they're metaphors that probably made, your hair is like if I said to Shannon, your hair is like the flock of goats. Don't try this, gentlemen, at home. Don't try this tonight. These aren't wooing words. Your cheeks are like halves of the pomegranate behind your veils. What is that? I mean, pomegranates are all big and bulgy, and if you poke them, they have, they're all pink and. But I mean, so there's just this sense of but the longing in this, the love, you don't hear it if you're just reading it from like, what are these images? These things don't make a sense to me. But when you look through the layer of that, these are meant to be showering this female character with love and affection and praise. And so think of each one of these in the same way Song of Songs is the superlative of the wisdom books or the wisdom literature, and so to speak. This is the superlative of what it meant to compliment a woman.
But it's not, it's what you think love should be, but I don't know if it really is. It's all physical to me, and it's not emotional. That intimacy that you can get in real life.
Yeah.
Well, there's some that's more metaphorical, a fountain closed off to all others. The intimate nature of it, a spring in the garden, a fountain of pure water. Those aren't just necessarily physical images. They're refreshing.
No, and I don't even think it's really meant to praise the physical side of it as much. I mean, again, I think the intent is not to describe what an ideal woman was like in that period as much as it is. There probably is a much deeper metaphor to what they mean, in some of these expressions. Your neck is like a tower of David built in the courses. Well, like, I don't know how that's a compliment, but there obviously is something embedded in that saying that would have meant something to that culture beyond, and I think we can read into it, strength or whatever it might be, but I do think it's interesting that in 4, it switches to some of the language, or it might have been in 4, I don't remember, but I know that I made note of 4:9. It says, "You've ravished my heart, my sister, my bride." 10, "How sweet is your love, my sister, my bride." And you might be like, well, that's kind of weird. She's talking to a sister. Well, I think this is more like sister in humanity. Like we are brothers and sisters in this project called humanity, not necessarily his biological sister. Naturally, otherwise that would be kind of weird. Again, the one I was talking about earlier is, I guess, in 5, "I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking." This is the Christ coming to our hearts. "Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, and my locks with the drops of night." This is, Christ wanting to, in an allegorical sense, saying, "Let me in." Like, and then the woman's voice is in 3, "I have put off my garments, but how could I put them on again? I bathed my feet, how could I soil them again? But my beloved," again, the man is described as the beloved, "thrust his hand into the opening, and my innermost part being yearned for him. I rose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh," again, oil, in the fingers with liquid myrrh." And this is all very sensual. Dripping and hand and upon the handles of the bolt I opened to my beloved, but he was gone. And this is that teasing and that interplay of back and forth. And again, I'm sort of like, I can see more of the sexual overtones than the allegory of Christ and the church in it. But I think that the same union, or the same deep connection that it's meant to describe between the male and the female, and the relation of characters in this, is meant to embody or project that sense of intimacy that we have with God. Later in 5, you get the female description of the man. "My beloved is all radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000." And then you get in 6 the reverse of that. You get a description again of a woman. "Your teeth are like flocks of ewes that have come up from washing, all of them bear twins." And so like your sheep, they've just come up from being cleaned up, and your teeth are nice and white and fluffy, I guess. And so it goes through this, and then you get it, and then it kind of closes out with this chapter 8. And again, it was one of these things where it goes into this sort of protective nature of this young girl, this young woman, and when she is ready, and it ultimately comes down to this 8 verse 14, where it just says, "Make haste, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag upon the mountain of spices." And then it's one of the things that have baffled scholars throughout time, is it just ends. It's like there was no conclusion, like it just stops. Like something got cut off. You're like, where's the end part? Did my pages get stuck together? But it sort of shifts in this last chapter into this, and it still ties into the theme, but and then it just ends, and that's where we end.
Enough is enough.
Enough is enough.
Right, see you later.
Yeah.
Light up.
So, what role does it function? I guess in the end, I would say is, I think that it really describes in a way that is not our cultural expression, what intimacy and longing and desire and passion are, and not even necessarily meant to be in a sexual sense, but meant to be in a far deeper, more powerful, connective sense than often this book is getting credit for. And ultimately, I think the reason that it has probably endured time and has been a place to describe love is because we have probably been able to interpret it in the sense of Christ and the church, or Christ and the body, Christ and his bride, in a way that helps us understand that there's a longing and a desire, and that someday that culmination of that union between our spirits and God's spirits, and our life in eternity. And it draws back to those pictures or images of paradise, and also then gives us a foretaste or a picture of paradise, the paradise yet to come. And that's the best I can do with Song of
It's a pretty good
Songs.
job.
Good
And
job.
I didn't even use any illustrations at all.
Oh, thank you.
Thank goodness.
You had your work cut out.
I don't even know what next week is, to be honest with you. Is it Isaiah? Oh, good. We're stepping away from now we're going to get back to, so this is, I'm just going to go ahead and stop there. And then I'm going to give you a little, stop